Good evening and welcome back to Kevin Toll Reads. Today I'm doing another video in the video series Why You Should Read, and today's author is going to be none other than Stephen King. My favorite author. I could talk about this for a long time, but I'm going to be concise as much as possible here. So a little bit about Stephen King. He was born in 1947. Portland, Maine was where he was born. A lot of his stories all revolve around Maine. We'll get into that a little bit later. He has written 65 novels, 12 collections of short stories and novella-length novels. His first completed novel was Carrie, which he published in 1974. He sold over 400 million copies worldwide in his career, and he writes under a plethora of genres, from Western to mystery to horror to fantasy to thrillers to police procedural to hard case crime, to fiction, literary fiction, to nonfiction. Most of his books will span multiple different genres as well. He's won a ton of awards. I mean, way more than I could list here. He's won a Hugo, a Bram Stoker Lifetime Achievement Award, a National Medals of Arts. I mean, I think when I did my research, it was over 20 awards. Some unique kind of cool facts about Stephen King. He's written 7 novels under the pen name of Richard Bachman. He first published books under Richard Bachman just because he was a little unsure of himself, and one of the first ones, The Long Walk, that he published under Richard Bachman, wasn't a huge success, and he got rejected several times when he was first starting out. A cool fact was that when he was trying to get his first novel published, he borrowed $75 from Tabitha, his wife's mom, just to try to make a go at it, and luckily got someone to give him an advance and get his money back and was able to pay her back. But I thought that was interesting. I mean, can you imagine being the guy that passed on a Stephen King novel back in the late 60s, early 70s now? One other interesting fact, too, is Rage that he wrote. It was a novella that is usually published up until recently under the 4 Bachman books. It was published as kind of a collection. That novel, he stopped having them circulate and publish because of the content. It deals with a school shooting, so became a very sensitive topic in the world, and he had that stopped. So that is, when you do find that in circulation, and I did once have a copy of that beat up paperback that had that copy of Rage, so I actually read that, but I no longer have that collection anymore. But that was published with Road Work, Rage, The Long Walk, and Running Man, which are 4 books that are of the 7 that are published under the Richard Bachman pseudonym. Another kind of interesting fact is, first editions by Stephen King are sought after by collectors, especially avid readers that call themselves constant readers, is what we call ourselves, the fans of Stephen King. And so first edition, Viking Press, I mean, those are heavily sought after. I was at one of my bookstores that I frequent, and they actually had the black hardback collection of Rage, Running Man, The Long Walk, that 4-book collection, which is heavily sought after as well, and they were selling it. It was an okay condition. It was over $100. But some of his books, his early Dark Tower books, some of his early like Salem's Lot and other Shining original copies, I mean, thousands. I mean, you can find them for thousands of dollars. So it's interesting that, people collect those type of things. He writes a lot about authors, obviously, in many of his books, from Misery to his Dark Tower book, he actually wrote himself in. I mean, that's an interesting thing. I mean, you don't have a lot of authors that write themselves into their stories, but his magnum opus, which is The Dark Tower, he actually wrote himself in as a character, and it actually works really, really well in the arc of the story. So, yeah, he's very infamous like that. There's also, a multiverse when it comes to Stephen King's work. His stories are interrelated, whether characters who sold things or done things, or he drops Easter eggs and there's naming conventions and stuff that adds up to 19, and it's all related around the nucleus of the Dark Tower and the multiverse of Stephen King. A lot of the stories, again, revolve around Maine, specifically Castle Rock and Derry. A lot of interesting things happen there. And so, that's definitely a nucleus into this kind of multiverse that Stephen King has created throughout his stories that center around the Dark Tower and that collection. He's comes from obviously a family of writers. Tabitha, his wife, writes, is a writer, is published. Both sons, Owen and Joe, are writers and have published. Joe, his son, writes under the pseudonym Joe Hill, but he's actually Joe King. Some other interesting facts, the idea of Pennywise, the clown from It, that actually came to him when he was writing The Stand out in Boulder, Colorado, and he got the idea from a troll when he was out on one of his walks. Stephen King's infamous about his walks, and that's how he got into the car accident, in the late 90s. So that was interesting, and that whole kind of story is also written when he wrote himself into the Dark Tower. That is written in there as well. Another kind of fun fact in my research too was the fact that 60 movies have been made from Stephen King books. 60. It's kind of crazy. So what makes Stephen King a great author? There's a lot to unpack there. In particular for me, he writes coming of age and slice of life better than any author that I've ever read, period. Some people think, there's some other writers that do a really good job when it comes to that as well. Dan Simmons is one that comes to mind, but to me, King writes coming of age, really, really well, especially when he's dealing with the time period of anywhere from the 70s to the 90s. I think he does a really, really good job. When it comes to Americana, setting the stage, and when you think about, some of his books, The Talisman, 11/22/63, It, The Kids in It, the novella The Body, which is adapted into the movie Stand By Me. All of those slice of life and kids in that story are so good. So yeah, another kind of example of what makes him really, really good. And when I think about this, and obviously I have, this particular novel up here is one of my favorite novellas, is The Shawshank Redemption, which is titled in the book Rita Hayworth in The Shawshank Redemption. And it's one of my favorite movies of all time. And the novella is dynamite as well. It's really, really well done. So I have a couple things I wanted to share too from an excerpt standpoint, and which is really kind of speaks to the level and quality of his words. In specifically different seasons here, when we're talking about the novella Rita Hayworth and The Shawshank Redemption, there's one part in here, and it's towards the end, and it's said in the movie as well towards the end of the movie, but in King wrote, "Remember that hope is a good thing, Red, maybe the best of things, and no good thing ever dies." And that's always stuck with me. Obviously, if you're a fan of The Dark Tower and book one, The Gunslinger, the opening is so just complex and dramatic. The man in black fled across the desert and the gunslinger followed. And that's how that whole story starts. And it's just very iconic. I've read the Dark Tower series 5 times. It may be 6, actually. I've lost count, but I know it's at least 5 times. And I'll probably end up reading it again soon because I just like it that much. When it comes to where to start reading King, there's a ton of entry points. Even those things are connected, whether it's a Dark Tower referenced related book or it's just interconnected in the King multiverse, you can start in a lot of places. I don't recommend, diving into the actual 8 Dark Tower books, but there's several entry points into King's writing and works if you haven't sampled it. And I actually do have another video on my channel that I did a couple months ago where I talk about, kind of what my favorite Stephen King stuff is, and kind of gives you ideas as well. But it depends on your taste in terms of what you enjoy. If you're looking for stuff that's more literary, obviously Misery Revival, The Green Mile come to the forefront. Those are all really good stories. If you're more into like the horror stuff, you have The Shining, you have Salem's Lot, you have It, you have Desperation, Pet Sematary. Those are all really, really good books. Fantasy, you have The Dark Tower, obviously, you have Talisman, you have Fairy Tale, you have The Stand, you have Under the Dome. Those are all really, really good. And when it comes to mystery, I highly recommend the Mr. Mercedes trilogy, The Outsider. I think those are really, really good. Novellas, if you like novellas and short story kind of collections, I think there's some really good entry points there. If you like Four Past Midnight, if you like Different Seasons, I think Skeleton Crew and Night Shift are two of his best short story collections. I mean, some of those short stories are just dynamite. And if you like hard case crime, I think Joyland and Later are the two best of his hard case crime books. He's wrote 3. I don't like The Colorado Kid, so I wouldn't recommend that one. But 2 out of the 3 are really, really well done. My overall thoughts, obviously King is my favorite, so I'm very, very biased. But I do think he has something for everyone, regardless of, where you kind of fall. His Dark Tower, again, is his magnum opus. I think it's something that is just going to stand the test of time as one of the greatest fantasy, and it's on a lot of all-time fantasy lists, even though it's not traditional in the fantasy. It's just so out there that it's always up there with people's top 10. I find his short stories collections amazing. I mean, there's so much to unpack and read with Stephen King that by the time you're done and caught up, which I finally have read everything, that by the time you circle around and try to reread something that you enjoy, it's like reading it again. If I get into a reading slump, I pick up a King book and it just cures me. It really does. He's that good of a writer. There has been a couple recent ones that were no good. Holly, I did not like it. I didn't like King. King is starting to get a little more political. At least he did in that book. The most recent book, You Like It Darker, which was a collection of a couple novellas and short stories, I thought was really good. It started to delve into the political in one section of the book, but overall it was a solid entry. And I think he shied away from that and learned his lesson in Holly, where he was overly used the political narrative, and so it was very decisive about that as well. So outside of that one, I'm really into what he's writing, and he's definitely the author that I drop everything to when it's Stephen King release day. So I hope this kind of gives you some ideas. If you're a Stephen King fan, I'd love to see you comment below. You drop me, what are your favorites? They're probably mine as well. I would love to hear from you. If you haven't read King and you got some other questions, feel free to comment below and let me know. I'm happy to give you my opinion. And I hope you enjoy this video. I knew it was going to be a long one, so thanks for sticking out with me. And I hope, again, you enjoy this content, and I hope you have a good evening. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks. Bye.